Colleagues, it's my great pleasure to thank on behalf of all of you, Hillside Memorial Park, for sponsoring today's session. And I think you all know that Hillside not only supports the endeavors of PARR, but also so many of the programs
Hello.
at Hebrew Union College.
With that, I turn this over to Suzanne Singer to introduce our guest speaker.
Good morning or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. It is my great privilege to introduce Dr. Andrew Rehfeld as our speaker this morning. Dr. Rehfeld is the 10th president of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. He is a distinguished academic who brings distinctive intellectual, spiritual, and professional qualities to lead the College Institute's mission, which is to transform the Jewish community and the broader world. He brings to HUC-JIR a passion for teaching and scholarship, as well as exemplary leadership skills that have set him apart as a dynamic, visionary, and community builder. His deep personal commitment to Reform Judaism and to Jewish values, his profound understanding of the impact of nonprofit Jewish institutions, and entrepreneurial spirit of innovation will lead HUC-JIR to greater excellence. Dr. Rehfeld has bridged both the academic and Jewish worlds as assistant professor of political science, an associate professor of political science at Washington University in St. Louis, and as president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. A tenured professor of political thought at HUC-JIR, he brings to the College Institute an unusual combination of teaching and scholarship, experience in Jewish nonprofit administration, and volunteer community leadership. President Rehfeld earned a PhD in political science and a master's of public policy from the University of Chicago, and a BA with a Phi Beta Kappa in the philosophy honors program at the University of Rochester. He's the author of The Concept of Constituency from Cambridge University Press and numerous articles. Dr. Rehfeld's research focuses on contemporary democratic theory with related interests in the history of political thought and the philosophy of the social sciences. He's published on the political uses of the Hebrew Bible and has taught yearly courses on Zionism and Jewish political thought at Washington University in St. Louis. The topic this morning is a Jewish political scientist's take on the 2020 election, lessons and opportunities. In this discussion, Dr. Rehfeld will talk about the results and the implications of the election on the Jewish community. How do they reflect our preferences and our values? What are the future prospects for America, Israel, and the globe, given the results? And what should we be teaching and preaching about this moment, given the persistence of partisanship and conflict within our public sphere? Dr. Rehfeld.
Rabbi Singer, thank you. It is my honor completely. You know, we were going to talk about the election, but given that it's still up in the air who won, I'm not sure what I'm going to have to say. That was a joke, just for the record. Obviously some very serious things follow from that are not so joking. But Boker Tov, good morning, everyone in California, early afternoon here in New York. It's been quite a week, and I'm certainly much more optimistic now, despite my comments, that the strength of our institutions that carried us through 244 years of American history, even as deeply imperfect and morally flawed as they have been, will nevertheless get us through what is an historically divisive moment for this nation. And I think that how we choose to respond as a Jewish community and how your leadership will take us there will depend on whether or not that's true. I want to thank Rabbi Singer for asking me to join with you today. Her request was actually made immediately after my first session. I think it was my first session with you in January in Palm Springs when I was with you at PARR last year. Though I'm sorry we're not together in California right now, as I'm sure we all are. I have to tell you that In New York City, the weather here is about 74 degrees. It's sunny, it's beautiful. So, I feel like we're back together except via video. It's a small silver lining from the fact that our planet is destroying around us. So if we're doing everything we can, let's at least take advantage and enjoy the terribleness of that. Again, a very serious topic, but little lightness. My talk today is meant to look at some takeaways from the election. And even as I must say, there is some significant uncertainty still ahead. And with the growing refusal of the Republicans to even come out and acknowledge Biden's win, it poses some serious and very dangerous threats. So it's too early to say if those are in fact going to materialize, because there's a timetable for legal challenges that we're still well within. So there's not yet a reason to be absolutely concerned, but there's enough reason to be concerned to keep an eye on that. There's also a very big open question about how we will move forward, given that the open races in Georgia will decide who holds the Senate. And as I'll talk about today, that's going to matter a lot for what the future implications of this election are, which cannot be foretold until we figure out what happens in the Senate. So I want to begin tonight. I don't mean tonight, I mean today. I'm sorry, I'm distracted by my PowerPoint. I'm going to share if I can. Can I share my screen? I'm sorry.
I will make you a
Please, thank
co-host. Hang on just one sec.
That's okay.
And by the way, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat and we will allow time for a chat with Dr. Rayfeld.
Okay,
There you
great,
go.
thank you. So the title of my talk is Prophetic versus Pragmatic Judaism, and it's a theme that I'm going to come back to at the end. What the tension here is, and I think one of the big takeaways from this election is that the prophetic voice that I am so proud of our graduates, many of you being on the front lines of history, particularly over the last 3 months, may have actually made this a much closer election than it otherwise would have been. And we'll talk about a little bit of those dynamics and what that means for how we think about activism and our role going forward. But I want to begin by the, sorry, just a technical issue, with this quote from Vice President-elect Joe Biden. It's time to put away the harsh rhetoric, lower the temperature, see each other again, listen to each other again, and to make progress, we have to stop treating our opponents as our enemies. They are not our enemies, they are Americans. They are Americans. And this really, for me, embodies the challenge that we have right now and that we are particularly well suited to face in the Jewish community. The same day, of course, that these results were being determined, November 7th, we learned of a really tragic loss for the Jewish people. And that is that the loss of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. It's hard to fully appreciate the effect that Rabbi Sacks had and will continue to have on Jewish life throughout our world. As chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, he took on a role as an Orthodox Jew that was in part community builder, part teacher, part pastor, and a public face of Jewish life in Great Britain and around the world. And through his Jewish writings, reaching a far wider audience than even someone in his position would have otherwise. His decisions as a public leader, I just want to say clearly and forcefully, were not always as ecumenical, perhaps, as his public image was. And we know that, and we can recognize that. But at the same time, we have to, in a man's passing, choose to focus on what benefit and the benefit of his life that he left behind. In my view, it's well captured by the quote from his book, The Dignity of Difference. It's on your screen right now, and that Rabbi Jacobs posted a few days ago on Facebook with his quote to support it. As Sacks says, one belief that more than any other is responsible for the slaughter of individuals on the altars of the great historic ideals. It's the belief that those who do not share my faith or my race or my ideology, and that's most important for us right now, do not share my humanity. At best, they are second-class citizens. At worst, they forfeit the sanctity of life itself. Excuse me. And as Rick says, our world desperately needs to learn his brilliant and timely Torah. We mourn his death and treasure his life. Now, I'm beginning to talk this way, not only because of the vice president's election as president-elect, and not only because of the loss of a great man, Rabbi Sacks, but also because it well frames some of this thought, the questions that we have about the public good. I had the opportunity to public engage with Rabbi Sachs in St. Louis 5 years ago. In a community conversation, we sparred over this very idea. We sparred over the idea of how self-interest can play a role in shaping moral society. And as we think about the after effects of this election, I think that we have to see this as a question of self-interest versus the common good. Now, in Sachs's view, morality involves overcoming self-interest. And in many ways, this is a common idea of what the function of religion serves, is to combat our self-interest. Of course, in Judaism, we have both the good and the bad within us, the Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov. I have a much more Maimonidean approach to this, that the role of morality and ethics is actually to shape self-interest through the cultivation of habit and discipline. Not so that we are overcoming self-interest, but rather that our self-interest is shaped through that cultivation so that we pursue for ourselves what is actually good for the whole. We take pleasure in doing what is good for all. It's what Tocqueville would call in the early 19th century self-interest rightly understood. And it represents a kind of pragmatic approach to our collective problems. It is, in my view, the very heart of Maimonides' ideas about how to achieve the collective good, built upon Al-Farabi and Aristotle before him. But either way, Sachs's commitment to the common good and to the demand that we have to treat each other as vessels of the divine, no matter our disagreements, is a lesson that I think we must heed now more than ever, particularly in the aftermath of this election. And as I hope we can explore together today in the next few minutes and over the next hour, I think going forward, it will be important for us to embrace an approach that is perhaps more pragmatic than prophetic as we look towards pursuing justice in the face of the divisions that remain in our nation. And that's both because a more prophetic approach may in fact not only deepen our divisions, but be in fact counterproductive. I hope that's a little bit provocative because I don't want you ever to pull away any of us from prophetic Judaism. Question is in its applied space. So here's the outline of the topics I want to talk about today. Number one, I'm going to talk about the politics, what it means to have a return to reality in science, talk about the importance of the Senate, some views about the policies that were likely to change or not. Talk about the relationship between Biden and McConnell, which is going to shape in a way that I don't think it ever allowed between Obama and McConnell. Talk about some political power issues, asking the question, should Jews be voting for Israel? And why was the election so close? A question of law and order, public voting, and prophetic versus pragmatic Judaism. We'll be finishing around 3 p.m. this afternoon. That was a little humor again. I'm sure you know by now how difficult it is to try to be humorous because you simply cannot read the crowd on Zoom. So I appreciate, now that I have the gallery, and I appreciate your smiling at least to show that you're tracking that I'm trying to make a joke. So let's talk about some immediate politics. The first thing that's really important to note about this is that this is one of the very few elections where the House differed from the presidential election. That is, the presidency usually, particularly with a new president, brings along with it gains in the House. And this time you saw a loss of Democrats in the House due likely to two reasons. Number one, the path that Trump was on was by and large supported by a lot of Americans. And number two, from the 2018 elections, which saw historic gains by the Democrats for even for an election. So, just in terms of the politics and the actual numbers of things. But the first immediate result of this election, I think, regardless of who takes the Senate, is a return to reality in science. And I can't emphasize how that is going to change things, because as soon as you get a return to reality, the public discourse will change, in that you can't appeal to fake news anymore. You actually have to be appealing to what is real. And I think you see this with Biden's approach to his the appointment of this task force to deal with the coronavirus, based as it is on science and technology. Number two, the importance of the Senate. Just to say this clearly, there's the two runoff elections in Georgia will determine not only whether or not the Democrats take the Senate, and they would take it by getting to 50 plus Harris's vote as vice president. But it's also going to guide the nature of the policies. And I should say not only the policies, but also Biden's cabinet. The cabinet shapes a tremendous amount of what happens in American government. And so long as we have a Republican Senate, you're going to see a much more conservative or moderate cabinet, or at least you should expect to see it. It is possible that both Warren and Sanders could find a home in a Biden cabinet. It is unlikely that both, or maybe even either, will find a home if, in fact, the Republicans hold on to the Senate. So that's something as we think about what policies to expect, what to expect. Big things of importance to the Jewish community, of course, things like Israel, LGBTQ plus and reproductive rights. Not a whole lot is going to change there. I will say on Israel, I would say much more of the comportment towards Israel, a return to the two-state solution, a re-invitation to Palestinian partnership is going to be, I believe, something to expect. Biden has a terrific leader of his Jewish outreach, and there's a whole page on what they expect to do and what they were promising. So I'd encourage you to go to that page. I don't need to rehearse it, but just to say the typical things that we'd expect will be reinforced. I'll also say, and I know that I'm speaking, if I have my crowd right, to a mostly Biden audience, we have to nevertheless, and certainly that's true of the Jewish community, we have to accept the fact that there were certain achievements, particularly with the Abraham Accords, that Trump did achieve for what I believe will be stability in the Middle East. The opening up with countries like UAE and Qatar. These are forward momentum, and forward momentum that will create a pressure on other Arab countries to accept Israel in the League of Nations. And I think so long as you head in this direction, it will ultimately even be good for the Palestinians. So it's a challenge to us, of course, those of you who may have felt viscerally objectioning to Trump and Trump's policies, to nevertheless recognize some of the good that will come of what was happening in the Middle East. And we have to do so. Other policies, LGBTQ plus and reproductive rights, I think we're back on a trajectory that is much more aligned with mainstream positions within the Jewish community. Not universal positions within the Jewish community, but mainstream ones, and ones that our movement has very proudly endorsed. So I don't have much more to say about that. I think that was one of the drivers of why the Jewish community disproportionately supported the Biden candidacy. I should say, by the way, the Jewish community's vote turnout is estimated at about 78%, which is more or less the same as what it was in the Clinton election. However, that may be overstating the turnout for Trump. In other words, it may be understating the Jewish response. And that's because election polls are done mostly in person. So they're done by doing a sample of different places throughout the country and then aggregating it. But we know that this had a historic mail-in voting that was skewed to Democrats. That means any in-person exit polling that you're hearing now is almost certainly going to be updated in the future by better and more accurate polls. It's almost certainly going to be overstating the vote for Trump. It may well be explaining the anomalous result of Black support for Trump increasing by 50%. If you're looking at people that are disproportionately showing up to polls to vote for Trump, you're going to disproportionately count. I want to say again, all of the numbers for exit pollings you should treat with a fair amount of skepticism, as still not a lot is known about the voting, and there'll be analysis to unpack this much more fully. So I've talked about the cabinet, I've talked about policies. Let's talk about the judiciary. One of the great hypocrisies of the last administration was the demand that in February of 2016, President Obama could not advance a Supreme Court justice, but somehow in October or September of 2020, they could. I don't have to tell you how hypocritical that was. I would just put a pin in the fact, in the spirit of comedy and in the spirit of holding ourselves accountable, if you made that argument, that they should honor what they did back in 16, let us remember that many of us in 2016 were saying the president's the president until he's not the president, and the president has the right to nominate a Supreme Court justice. So it's a little challenging to argue against hypocrisy. We can certainly argue without falling into the trap ourselves. We can certainly argue that in terms of the advancement of Amy Coney Barrett, that there was a violation of the very precedent that they established back in 2016, which is the much stronger reason to object to the advancement of Barrett at that point. I'm sure I've said something that was not clear because I'm looking at some like Yoel and others who are looking confused. Either that or something's come up on your Facebook feed or your YouTube video that you're watching. That's probably Yoel. Okay. But I'm happy to clarify the questions. The last thing is the working relationship with McDonald that I mentioned. Biden actually has a history of working with McConnell. It is what, to the extent that there was some traction in the Obama White House, they seem to have a pre-existing relationship. It's one of the places where Biden was exposed on the left, and that Kamala took aim at him when he is defending these people. But it is one of his signature strengths that he's a man of the middle. He's a man of compromise, and that could be very good for more moderate progress against a particularly an extreme white set of policies that are on the right, if you believe getting to the moderate is a good thing. If you believe, again, if you're on the far left, that getting to the moderate place is actually worse because the moderate policies are harder to change once they're there to the far left, and we want to wait to get a further left, that'll be the trade-off that you're likely to see. Okay, let me move now to the second issue that I wanted to raise about political power. And I put up on my slide 7, 9, and 1. Anyone, any takers? I should ask you the question. You could put it in chat. What does 7, 9, and 1 indicate in terms of Jewish political power post-election? Any takers? I just opened my chat. No one's venturing to guess.
You can even unmute and answer the question if you'd like.
Yeah.
Well, it's not 999, that's for sure.
What would 999 be?
That was what's his name? The guy who just died.
Herman Cain, Zichrono Livracha.
Yes,
Oh.
Herman Cain's economic theory about taxes or something. It's 999.
Oh, good Lord. I didn't even track what that was. Thank you.
It also means no, coincidentally.
That's funny.
So 7, 9, and 1, boy, you guys, you're all risk takers in the area of spirit and community building and in prophetic voice, but not in guessing in front of a teacher's. I get it. Okay, so 7, 9, 1, it's the percentage of Jews in the House, in the Senate, and in the position of second gentleman of the nation. That is, we now have a Jewish second gentleman. By the way, I will fully own, I don't know what the right gender appropriate description of that person is. I'm just taking the convention of first lady, second lady, and applying it to gentlemen. I am more than happy to get corrected if there isn't a more appropriate one. But there's an important question to ask. I mean, first of all, does that not fill us with pride? The idea that here we are, a community of fewer than 2% in the United States. We have 7% of the House, 9% of the Senate. It could even be more depending on Georgia because of the candidates makeup there, and the second gentleman of the country. Of course, if we're not Jewish and we say that, we're anti-Semitic. But don't quote me on that, and thank you for scrubbing that from the recording. But there is a sense in which it is a reflection of our achievements in the United States. When you think about the diversity issue, this is something that we really should hold up about the Jewish community, the striving, the ambition, the commitment to excellence and public service. As much as we think about politicians as corrupt, as much as we think about politicians as the second lowest profession, I mean, whatever the jokes are, these are people that are making something of their lives for the sake of other people. And when we think about that, and when we talk about what that means, we don't have to talk about it in terms of our achievement. We can talk about our commitment to the public good in that pathway. So that to me is a very big takeaway from this. The next point is a question of, is it okay for Jews to vote for Israel? So one of the big takeaways that seems true is that the Trump administration has mobilized particularly Orthodox Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews to get involved in the electoral system in a way they never have been before. And many of them are doing so not only to defend in local elections, like in New York, public subsidies for schools and other social service programs, but also because what they see in Israel. And I want to ask this question by taking a step back and asking the question, is it ever good to promote the welfare of any other country with a vote? That is, I find it baffling that people think that this is a good thing. I think it's absolutely, I think it's anti-American, to just say it straight out, to be voting for a president who is going to deliver to Israel, if that's your only aim. Now, you know, if you found out that the Palestinians were voting for who's going to advance Palestinian good, you might feel the same way. Aren't they supposed to be contributing to public good? So there are two other options that you can think about what a Jewish vote is doing. Number one, you can ask, is it good for America? And although it's hard sometimes to disengage our self-interest from Israel from what's good for America, I think that if there's a way to frame it, we should be forthright and be reframing people that say that they're voting for so-and-so because it'll be good for Israel in terms of why being good for Israel is good for America. We have an obligation to frame it that way. And number two, promote the idea of justice, that it isn't good enough simply to vote for something because it is in our self-interest, but rather for the justice of the whole. Okay. So let me move to more conclusions. One big section that I want to speak of about why the election was so close, and then some reflections on what we can take in terms of language and building more of a common purpose. And then we can open it up to some questions. So one of the, I think one of the great surprises that I had, that maybe many of you had, is that in light of a man who has articulated so few of what we would say are moral values of character, of Musar, I don't think anyone has said Musar and Trump in the same sentence. How is it that he could command the over 70 million votes? It looks like, I guess it's about 70 million votes. How could the election be so close? I mean, my goodness, the 1984 election of Ronald Reagan beat Walter Mondale by, I think it was about 17 million votes. It was something like 54 to 37 million votes at the time. And is the gap between those two greater than between President Trump and Biden? So what's going on? Well, first of all, what I said before, the policies that were being pursued were ones that had resonated, and we saw that in the House elections. But there is there's a second piece to it, and that is, yes, there could be underlying Musar Lahavdil Trump. Good. Okay, there. Thank you, Gil. But I want to think about this, that number one, it could be a reflection that the very values that we see in Trump, and we saw this before, are hidden, that people will say one thing because there was a gap between the polls, of course, in the election, and vote another. And here I want to introduce an idea that I've been advocating for, not seriously, but as a thought experiment that I would pose to you. And that is that we ought to stop having secret votes. That is, our votes are protected by privacy. Don't ask me who I voted, it's my right not to tell you. The vote is the only political act that we as citizens exercise over each other. It's not an expression of opinion. I mean, it is an expression of opinion, but that's not what a vote is. You can express your opinion by just telling your neighbor what you think. The vote is an act of political power over other people. If you voted for Biden, you caused a president to have the nuclear codes that can obliterate the world and change domestic policy and secure rights for marriage equality for everyone, et cetera. And if you voted for Trump, you had the power to impose that will on everyone else. There's not a single democratic exercise of power that is protected by privacy. In the end, there are transparency laws because we think it's important to be accountable. So one of the takeaways from this is, should we be thinking about making the vote public. Because if you did the same kind of public, the embarrassment, well, I can't tell my neighbors. Well, if you feel like you can't tell your neighbors, maybe that's telling you something about who you should or shouldn't be voting for. Now, I said when I began this point that it wasn't a serious political proposal, that it's a thought experiment, because the downside of coercion, the downside of those least protected is, to me, far outweighs the benefit of accountability. It's a thought experiment to have public voting because of the loss of accountability that may be reflected in these last two elections. If people were accountable for each other, for the power, I mean, what happened in 2016? It was the power of the private vote that imposed people's will on each other without any kind of accountability. So you'll ask, wasn't voting public in the early decades of this country? There was a lot of public voting and much more public balloting. You had to go and in many early American elections, take balls out of a jug. So you had to walk over, put balls in milk jugs, so these big milk jugs. And so you would declare who you're voting for, and you would put your ball, these little counters in a box. All of which is to say, so why does this matter? What explains Trump's election? So I said before, it could be policies, it could be racism, it could be the character. All of these are factors, but there's one other factor, and this speaks now directly to us and gets into prophetic versus pragmatic Judaism. And that's the factor that in 1968, through a serious academic analysis, it looks like the protests on the street depressed Democratic voting by about 2%. That is, votes that should have gone Democratic were instead cast for either Wallace or for Nixon in that election. And what's going on here is the idea that what had happened this past summer queued up the very narrative Trump tried to win on of law and order. And it was because the protests in the street, it was because of a certain holding back of some mayors in some cities, which, by the way, may well have been exactly the right thing to do, given what was happening on the street. But the point is that going out into the street, protesting, embracing this idea, defund the police, doing all of that, speaking, if you will, our prophetic voice, may have actually been counterproductive in the sense that it could have even cost an election. Now, that poses a hard question that I would ask of all of you. Should we, in these situations, be asking the question before we're leading our congregations to express what is the value, if you will, of the expression of a prophetic moral voice? Or should we be thinking about the pragmatic considerations? And of course, if you constantly consider the pragmatics, you'll never get to the prophetic. And if you're always leading with the prophetic, you're going to undermine because you're not getting at the pragmatic. Fortunately for us, we have terrific movement resources, and at the RAC especially, Jonah is nothing but a prophetic pragmatist. I mean, I think if you look at what the RAC is doing and bringing things back into our own congregations. So Rabbi Singer, we want to open this up to some questions and dialogue. Yes, sexism too. When I say racisms, I mean all bad things. Okay, if I could put that as a category: racism, sexism, homophobia, all of the things that are stirred up by Trump's rhetoric. I want to end with just one story, and it's a story because of the time that we're in, and really a teaching from our tradition for all of you that you might find helpful, and then we'll open it up for some questions. And it begins with this idea that, look, 2 weeks ago, we read the story of the Tower of Babel. It's a story that, of course, illustrates the importance of a shared language to build common purpose, and how important it was that we had that shared language back then. And look at what it led to, right? As God observed, if as one people with one language for all, this is how they have become to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. So their ambition, again, you know the story, gets ahead of them. And thus God scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Now, one thing that's really interesting about the story is it doesn't say that they immediately took to swords and fought each other, right? And think about it. Could you imagine what it might have been for them when lightning struck, as it were, and suddenly people could not understand what each other was saying? They would have surely been confused. And what do you do when you're confused? You ask questions when you don't understand what someone is saying. Imagine Rachel turned to Rivki after Rivki asked Rachel the question, confused, what do you mean, ugala bugala? And perhaps you meant, please pass more bricks, or I need some more bricks, right? So Rachel could begin with a question, even in the face of her hearing something, and maybe it wasn't ugala bugala, maybe it was something that in the new language sounded like an insult to Rachel. She could do that because they had already built a foundation of trust, and they were part of a collective purpose. And as the story from Genesis tells us, when they realized they could not communicate anymore, they were spread across the land, forming different peoples without any mention of conflict. Once people separate from one another, distrust grows, and language takes on a second, very different purpose, to distinguish friend or foe. And of course, here you jump towards Shoftim and the book of Judges. And after the Israelites conquered the land of Israel, of course, they divide into tribes and live right next to not only themselves, but their enemies. And in many cases, as we learn in the book, that their enemies looked and kind of almost sounded just like them. They couldn't distinguish. So very famously, in chapter 12 of the book of Judges, we learn that the Gileadites developed a test based on the fact that their neighbors could not pronounce the SH sound, the shin. And the Gileadites required all who passed through their land, you know this story, to utter shibboleth, an agricultural term that had no meaning, no content, right? Friends could say it correctly, pass through. But when somebody said shibboleth, what happens? They're put to the sword, brutal. You know, the book of Judges is our favorite book, right? Because it's like R-rated and you can read it and it's fun. So no questions asked. So language no longer was just a conveyor of ideas that allowed collective endeavors to be achieved. Words, individual words, became a signal to people of friend or foe. The Gileadites, of course, had a good reason to be suspicious of our neighbors. And so do today in our society, to bring this back home. Many people who are oppressed have great reason to fear that when they hear words uttered in the wrong way, they are dealing with a foe. And so we develop a kind of sensitivity. We develop a reaction when we hear people say things, and we're not in a spirit of collective purpose. And so as long as we treat each other's words and ideas as merely conveyors of signals of friends or foe, rather than as conveyors of ideas that need to be worked through, we'll never get back to the idea that represented in the story of Tower of Babel, back to a world where words and ideas that are not understood are greeted first with caution. Wait, what did you mean by ugala bugala? And when disagreement remains, and it will remain, we choose to respect each other's humanity, getting back to Jonathan Sacks, Tocqueville, Maimonides, peacefully if separately, without being greeted with the sharp end of the sword. Our work at HUC represents that idea perfectly. And we have so many ways that we are doing that. And I look forward at the end of this just to telling you a couple, but let me stop there. I've spoken way too long. Rabbi Singer, I proposed 10 minutes and you said 25, and now I think I've gone on for 72. Go ahead.
No, it was wonderful. I love your drosh, which I'm going to steal from you for one of my sermons coming up. A wonderful drosh. And thank you for that presentation. So right now there's 3 questions. I'm going to take the privilege of hosting this and ask the first one, and then I'm going to ask Evan to ask his question, and then Howard, and then we'll see if there are others after that.
And I would like, if I could have just about 3 minutes at the end, I want to make a couple of just end announcements, if that's
Sure,
okay.
sure.
Thank you.
And I will make announcements at the end as well.
Okay.
From reading some of Steve Wimuller's work and some other analyses that have come down, it seems like the Jewish vote was not so much about Israel. It seemed to be a very small percentage. It was sort of like down at the bottom of the list of things that people are concerned about. It was much more, it seems like, about pocketbook.
Yeah.
And I sent you that one quote from Steve that was from a few years ago. So I'd like you to address that, please, because it seems like maybe Jews are drifting away from our fundamental values and you know, favor of making sure our stock portfolios are doing okay.
Yeah, so this is where we get to, do you vote for your self-interest, or do you understand that your vote is your use of political power over other people? And until we start framing the vote not as an expression of our opinion, but as an exercise of power of the purse of the sword over our neighbors, we won't have any hope of skewing self-interest towards the common good. Look, I have tremendous respect for Steve. And I think that there is no doubt that as Jews have become less and less affiliated, less and less connected to our tradition, less and less connected to the atheistic secularism that drove most of us here. I can speak to that in a moment because I think that's an overlooked part of the Jewish community of our history. We become more integrated as capitalist Americans. And one of the reasons that economic inequality is so dreadful is that people do act on their own self-interest when casting the vote. And I think that Jews are no different. You know, I think it was Ben Gurion that said something like, we'll know that the Jewish state has succeeded when the thieves and the prostitutes are Jewish too. I think that there's some version of that quote that has been quoted to me. And I think we'll know that our success in America has been successful when we start acting in a way that crude capitalists do, in a sense. The number one reason that people who voted for Trump voted for him are said is because of the economy. It was 80 something percent. The second reason is safety and concern of crime, even though we are at historically low rates of crime. It's about 71%. I again would be much more tentative to tell you what subgroups actually voted for because I think the exit polls are not yet firm. But I think, look, Rabbi Singer, the straying of our Jewish community away from Jewish community is as much of the story as anything else. I would be interested to see, and I'm sure, Steve, I can ask him, I'm going to be in dialogue with him in December on a webinar. If you control for Jews who are members of congregations, who are actively invested in Jewish community, in federations, in JCCs, and you look at that subset, my guess is that their expression of the vote is what I would call a more responsible expression. Not what is it going to do for me, but what is it going to do for all? I'll just say one last thing about this, and then I'll turn to the next question. One challenge of rural, undereducated, lower income voters who have been voting for Republican for years is that they actually appear to be voting for what they believe is the common good and not their own self-interest. And I don't mean that ironically, I mean that seriously. They are the least likely to benefit from the kind of tax policies. And what they talk about voting for is a stronger America, is a fighting of terrorism, is bringing justice to our et cetera. So when we think about these themes, I think we have to hold ourselves and our own communities accountable in the way that Steve is suggesting.
Absolutely.
And
Okay.
respect what is motivating the other side, even if for us, the character and the Musar issues are ultimately going to get in the way.
Right. Thank you. Okay, Rabbi Evan Goodman, please ask your question.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate your presentation. So you referenced the McConnell relationship to President-elect Biden. And I too felt that that would make a difference. However, the actions of McConnell in the last 12 hours or so, after a period of silence, don't seem to be giving Biden that benefit of that friendship that we had hoped we would see. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, Rabbi Goodman, I condition this by saying I'm an optimist. So I read things and I ask not what are they up to, but rather, oh, wow, what are they up to? And here's what I'm thinking about this. Number one, we have to recognize Trump has a tremendous hold on the Republican Party. Number two, Trump will be the age of Joe Biden now in 2024. In other words, he's got another election coming. And so long as he is the face, the name, the voice, the head of the party, he will command a certain fealty. And you are seeing that fealty and the recognition. He delivered on the House. He delivered in many ways on the Senate. I mean, look at Susan Collins. What explains Susan Collins, if not that? So I think right now you could understand McConnell either as gearing up for a legal fight. I don't believe it's a legal fight that he has any chance of winning. I think the Supreme Court, which is just giving indications it's going to hold up the ACA, that is Obamacare. And we can talk about the Supreme Court, and I think it's much less dire than the predictions and the fears on the left, which gets to the prophetic versus pragmatic. But I think that McConnell is in this place. He's got to deliver for the Senate and to establish his leadership. He's still got two runoff elections in Georgia. The last thing he's going to do is alienate the guy that could deliver the Senate to the Republicans in any way. But I'm a Pollyanna, I will admit. I think it's dangerous. Let's say, remember what I said at the beginning, we are in uncertain times and very dangerous times if this doesn't resolve quickly.
Okay, Rabbi Howard Leibson has a question.
Yeah.
Howard, are you still there?
Yeah, muted.
Can you unmute?
Hello, I'm here. The question I had, please excuse me, had to do with something I read this morning on Israel Insider, I think it's called, a Jewish Insider, that Reverend Warnock in Georgia has signed on to a letter comparing the West Bank to South African apartheid. That concerned me as someone who supports Israel strongly.
He's one of the candidates for Senate in Georgia, just to fill that out. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for
Sure.
clarifying that. And when I posted the question, Scott Salson shared some information with me about that. So Scott, can I invite you to share with everyone what you shared with me?
Sure. I had received an email that was sent to, I think, all of the colleagues, at least in the Atlanta area, because that's my home, although I'm in Tucson, from Peter Berg, who said that he was not endorsing any candidate, but wanted to be sure that we understood that that thought was a distortion of Warnock's actual role. And if you go to Warnock's website, which is what Peter Berg cited, he has a statement on Israel that you can see that it's quite supportive of Israel. So I think this is just part of the political scene that's going on. People are looking to paint other people with brushes, you know. And I trust Peter Berg in his assessment. Haven't been in Georgia for a while, although I vote in Georgia. So I have to yield to his sensitivity. And as I said, I trust his sensitivity.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Nice to see you. And that's very helpful. I've been tracking this, and this is just in about the last 36 hours. I'm sorry to prepare for this to get you information, but I'll tell you the general concern that I have, and that is that folks that are using leadership, particularly of the Black community, to drive a wedge within the Jewish community. When I was at the Federation, I saw this happen in our own St. Louis, where we were pressed to distance ourselves from Black Lives Matter, which started 3 miles away from our campus, which is where Ferguson was. And it was destructive, and it was harmful, and it was not helpful. So certainly if somebody is publicly supporting BDS, if they are publicly in a political way aligning it with South Africa, that should give you some concern. But I have seen from others that I trust that this is not the case here, but you should do some due diligence. But I would say view it skeptically.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I can see a lot of people on my screen, so if you want to raise your hand, we can go ahead.
Suzanne, there was one that went into the chat earlier. I think it was maybe Michael Berg was asking about the death of Saeb Erekat and what that might portend for a Biden administration.
I didn't see that.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, and I'm sorry I didn't begin with this, really one of the, a very important negotiator and partner for peace is somewhat controversial in some ways, but nevertheless somebody that was pursuing for a period of time a close relationship and looking for solutions. What does this reflect? I think the bigger question is, what does the Palestinian leadership look like? which has been completely in shadow and completely overlooked for the last 4 years, and had been in decline, as it were, from from the lack of any number of things. I think that where the leadership was going is it will have to be a question that is asked. I think for a Biden administration, they're going to have much more credibility with Palestinian leadership because of their return to the approach. I tend to share Dennis Ross's view of this and David Makovsky's view of this, that it's not clear to me that our position should always be to simply say, oh, we're going to treat both sides, and look for partners in both sides. I think that arguably Obama made an error in trying to lead by first aligning with Islamic countries, with Arab countries, and I think the proof will ultimately be in the pudding. But I think coming post-Trump, Biden will have an immediate advantage with the Palestinians, and he will be able to get some traction on peace negotiations for a two-state solution. And folks, let's be clear, if there is not a two-state solution in Israel, Israel will no longer be a democratic and Jewish state. It's either going to be non-democratic or it's going to be not a Jewish state. So I hope that that is a priority for all of us.
Thank you again for a really excellent presentation, Dr. Rayfeld. We really appreciate it. I'd like to just give you some ideas about what's coming up for our PARR convention monthly online. So December 9th, which is a Wednesday at 10 a.m., Ilana Kaufman, the director of the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, will be speaking about racial justice and our multiracial Jewish community, engaging the moment, being the change. On January 21st, a Thursday at 1 p.m., these are all Eastern times, Plagues and Pesach, some classical halachic responses to pestilence, which will be presented by Dr. Alyssa Gray, who is a professor of codes and responsa at HUC in New York. February 23rd at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday, we will be hearing from Dr. Eric Ludwig, the director of the Zelikow School of Jewish Nonprofit Management at Hebrew Union College, who will be speaking about Jewish life underfunded, how innovation can disrupt the nonprofit starvation cycle. And you will, of course, be getting emails to this effect, so you don't have to remember all of this. Hope to see you at these other sessions.
Thank you. Freddie, thank you. I was going to recognize Freddie. I was also going to recognize our Dean, Josh Holo, who is here, or who was here at any rate earlier, and to say what, if she's putting it in, about the Levy Scholarship Fund, how important it is, and what an honor to really a transformative and great man at the institution. I hope you all will consider supporting it. And I want to thank all of you for your support of HUC, personally for many of you, and certainly through your congregations. We receive half of all the dues that come in from RMAC after an administrative fee is taken over. It's split equally between the URJ and HUC, and that allows our students to continue to serve and to be sustained in the education that is so important for the future of our community. So thank you, and thank you for taking the time, and thank you for having me, Suzanne. I really appreciate it.
Well, it was great to have you, and great to have so many people joining us this morning. And I want to thank Evan, our fearless president, and Larry, our fearless executive vice president, and our board for all the support and help that they've given as well.
And
So
I will close with thanking Suzanne for taking our convention virtual this year in this most challenging of eras. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to the about 50 people who were with us for the duration of the call. So thank you for taking an hour out of your day to join us and to be here with colleagues and to learn a little bit from one another. Thank you and have a good week.
bye-bye.